The 10 most controversial ideas in science. Number 1. Ulcers. For a century, every doctor knew they came from stress and spicy food, on the grounds that the stomach was far too acidic for anything to possibly live in. Then an Australian doctor named Barry Marshall became convinced a bacterium was the real villain, and, unable to talk anyone round, brewed up a flask of the things and drank the lot. He promptly came down with the exact disease he'd predicted, cured himself with antibiotics, and some years later collected a Nobel Prize. The most persuasive argument in the history of medicine, made by a man willing to use his own stomach as a petri dish. Number 2. The dinosaurs are not, as it turns out, extinct. When fossils first hinted back in the 1800s that birds might be the descendants of dinosaurs, the idea was eventually shelved as a charming coincidence. It was dusted off in the 1960s by a paleontologist named John Ostrom, who pointed out the unsettling similarities between birds and certain vicious little predators, and was met, predictably, with a great deal of scoffing. Then fossil hunters in China began pulling out dinosaurs covered in unmistakable feathers, and the argument was quietly over. So the next time a pigeon struts past and eyes your lunch, do show a little respect. You are looking at a dinosaur, and it has clearly come down in the world. Number 3. Genes that won't sit still. Geneticists pictured the chromosome as a tidy row of genes bolted into fixed seats, never budging. Then Barbara McClintock, squinting at the speckled kernels of multicolored corn, worked out that certain bits of DNA were getting up and wandering about, flicking other genes on and off as they passed. Her colleagues responded with a long, polite yawn. The idea was simply decades ahead of its time, so she shrugged, kept growing her corn, and waited 30 years for everyone to catch up and hand her a Nobel. The kicker: close to half of your own DNA is built from these restless, seat-swapping genes. You are, structurally, a fidget. Number 4. That a whole landscape can be carved in a single afternoon. In the 1920s, a geologist named J. Harlen Bretz studied the scarred, gouged terrain of eastern Washington and concluded it had been ripped open not by gentle erosion over millions of years, but by a series of apocalyptic floods. This was heresy. Geology had spent a century banishing biblical-style catastrophes in favor of slow and steady, and here was Bretz dragging the floods straight back in. He was ridiculed for the better part of 40 years, until everyone slowly realized he was right. An ice dam had failed and emptied an inland sea across the land in a matter of days. Bretz finally received geology's highest medal at the age of 96, and reportedly remarked that all his enemies were now dead, so he had nobody left to gloat over. Number 5. A particle invented purely to cover an embarrassing shortfall. In 1930, the books simply did not balance. Energy kept going missing in certain radioactive decays, threatening one of physics' most sacred laws. Wolfgang Pauli, and you have to admit the coolest name in the history of science, plugged the gap by proposing a tiny, ghostly, almost undetectable particle to carry the missing energy away, then promptly apologized, reportedly fretting that he'd done a terrible thing in dreaming up something nobody could ever hope to find. It took 26 years to prove him right, because the wretched things barely interact with anything at all. In fact, in the time you've been watching this, somewhere around 100 trillion of them have sailed clean through your body every single second, and you have felt precisely none of them. Number 6. The way every living cell keeps its lights on. For years, biochemists assumed cells powered themselves through some undiscovered chemical middleman and hunted high and low for it in vain. Then, a British eccentric named Peter Mitchell suggested the cell works more like a battery, pumping particles across a membrane to build up a charge, then letting them flood back through to drive the works. The establishment thought this was nonsense, so Mitchell did the only sensible thing. He quit and set up his own laboratory in a crumbling Cornish manor house, which he restored himself and helped pay for with a herd of dairy cows. From his cow-financed mansion, the outcast was proved comprehensively right, and in 1978 they posted him a Nobel Prize. Number 7. The idea that reality isn't there until you look. Quantum mechanics insists a particle has no definite properties until it's measured, and that two entangled particles can be carted off to opposite ends of the galaxy and still somehow coordinate the instant you check. Einstein loathed this so much, he dismissed it as spooky action at a distance, which remains the finest insult ever aimed at a perfectly correct theory. For decades it looked untestable, until John Bell found the loophole. The experiments came down firmly on the side of weird, and the whole business bagged a Nobel in 2022. The maths is bulletproof, and entanglement is real. The only thing nobody can agree on is what on earth it all means. Number 8. A crystal that breaks the rules of crystals. In 1982, a materials scientist named Dan Shechtman peered down his microscope and saw a pattern of atoms with a kind of symmetry the textbooks flatly forbade. Ordered, yet never repeating, which was supposed to be impossible. His own lab assumed he'd lost it. His group leader handed him a crystallography textbook and gently suggested he read it again. The great Linus Pauling, twice a Nobel laureate, announced there was no such thing as quasicrystals, only quasi-scientists. Shechtman was right, Pauling was wrong, and in 2011 the quasi-scientist toddled off to Stockholm to collect a Nobel Prize of his very own. Number 9. The Earth goes round the Sun. Obvious now. In 1633, grounds for a heresy trial. Galileo pointed his new telescope at the sky, found the evidence stacking up neatly behind Copernicus, and committed the cardinal sin of being right before the authorities were ready for it. The Church hauled him before the Inquisition, made him kneel and swear that the Earth stood perfectly still, which it does not, then placed him under house arrest for the rest of his days, with his book popped onto the banned list for good measure. It remains the most awkward case in history of putting the layout of the solar system on the naughty step. Number 10. Some infinities are bigger than others. Infinity sounds like the end of the line, until Georg Cantor proved in the 1870s that the decimals between 0 and 1 form a larger infinity than all the counting numbers combined, and that above those sits an endless staircase of bigger infinities still. Mathematics did not say thank you. His own former teacher, Kronecker, branded him a corrupter of youth and set about burying his career, and the campaign helped drive Cantor to repeated breakdowns. He was entirely right, of course. Set theory now sits quietly beneath all of modern mathematics, and the one question that tormented him most turned out to be impossible to settle within the standard rulebook of mathematics. Like and subscribe if you want more videos like these, and the description below has the references for everything we've covered, plus a few things to read if you'd like to learn more about any of these discoveries. Cheers.